The most expensive wedding in America began with two people silently hoping it would never become a real marriage. The crystal chandeliers inside St. Andrew's Cathedral scattered warm light across polished marble floors as cameras flashed from every direction. Every major business network in the country had sent reporters. Luxury magazines called it the wedding of the decade. Financial analysts called it the smartest corporate move of the year. Thousands of people watched from giant screens outside, while millions streamed the ceremony live from their homes. White roses lined the aisle, their delicate fragrance floating through the historic sanctuary. A full orchestra played softly beneath the soaring stained glass ceiling, adding elegance to a moment that looked like the perfect beginning of a fairy tale. Yet beneath every smile, every polished photograph, and every perfectly rehearsed step, a secret waited in silence. Ethan Carter stood at the front of the church, dressed in a perfectly tailored black tuxedo that matched his calm expression. At 35, the white billionaire had built Carter Global Technologies into one of the largest artificial intelligence companies in America. Magazine covers described him as fearless. Investors called him a visionary. Employees respected his discipline. But no article had ever mentioned the exhaustion hidden behind his blue eyes. For the past 6 months, Carter Global had been quietly collapsing beneath the weight of lawsuits, aggressive competitors, and frightened investors. One more failed quarter would trigger a chain reaction capable of destroying everything his late father had spent 40 years building. Ethan knew the truth because he had memorized every financial report until sunrise for weeks. Today wasn't just his wedding day. It was the deadline separating survival from disaster. The cathedral doors slowly opened. Every camera instantly turned. Olivia Bennet stepped inside wearing a timeless white wedding gown with lace sleeves and a simple veil that gently framed her face. She wasn't a celebrity. She wasn't the daughter of another billionaire. She wasn't an influencer followed by millions. She was simply a 27-year-old white woman whose quiet kindness had never appeared on the evening news. Her graceful smile looked natural enough to convince the world she had found the love of her life. Only she knew her heartbeat felt louder than the orchestra. Every step toward the altar reminded her of the signature she had placed on a thick legal contract only days before. The diamond ring on her finger sparkled brilliantly beneath the cathedral lights, but to her it still felt strangely unfamiliar, as if it belonged to another woman living another life. Ethan watched her approach without moving. Their eyes met for only a second, yet neither of them smiled. It wasn't hatred. It wasn't fear. It was the silent understanding shared by two strangers carrying the same impossible burden. Around them, guests whispered about destiny, romance, and the perfect match between beauty and success. They admired the expensive flowers, the famous guests, and the breathtaking decorations. Nobody noticed the nearly invisible hesitation before Olivia reached Ethan's side. Nobody noticed how carefully they avoided touching hands until the officiant gently nodded. The minister began speaking about commitment, trust, and unconditional love. Each beautiful sentence echoed through the cathedral with painful irony. Ethan answered every vow with steady confidence, his voice never shaking once. Olivia repeated each promise just as flawlessly, even though every word reminded her this marriage had never been born from romance. Outside the church, the stock price of Carter Global quietly began climbing. Financial reporters smiled into their cameras, announcing renewed investor confidence before the ceremony had even ended. The market believed stability had returned. Shareholders celebrated. Social media exploded with admiration for America's newest power couple. Hidden beneath Ethan's tailored jacket rested a folded document that no photographer would ever see. Hidden inside Olivia's small bridal bouquet rested a single brass key tied beneath the ribbon. One represented the agreement that had brought them together. The other represented a home she was desperately trying to save. Neither of them realized that before this marriage reached its first anniversary, one of those objects would become completely meaningless, while the other would change both of their lives forever. 3 weeks earlier, rain drifted gently across downtown Chicago, turning the sidewalks into mirrors that reflected office towers stretching into the gray afternoon sky. Olivia Bennet tightened the collar of her inexpensive beige coat as she hurried along State Street, with a canvas bag resting against her shoulder. Inside were a worn sketchbook, several colored pencils, and a folder filled with unpaid medical bills that had become heavier than the paper itself. At 27, she had imagined her life would revolve around teaching children to paint, filling classrooms with color instead of spending every evening calculating which bill could wait another month. Yet dreams had become a luxury she could no longer afford. Every Tuesday and Thursday, she taught free art classes at a neighborhood community center. Every evening, she worked part-time at a small bookstore whose owner insisted on paying everyone fairly even when business slowed. The combined income barely covered groceries, utilities, and the mortgage on the modest house where she had grown up with her parents. Since her father's passing 2 years earlier, that little white house with its aging front porch had become more than property. It was every birthday celebration, every Christmas morning, every family dinner, and every memory she refused to lose. Her mother, Margaret Bennett, now spent most of her days resting beside the living room window after months of expensive medical treatments. Although her condition had gradually improved, the cost had quietly emptied every savings account the family had ever built. Olivia never complained. Instead, she smiled every morning before leaving for work, hoping her mother would never notice the worry hidden behind her cheerful voice. That afternoon, she walked into First Community Bank carrying a small envelope containing another partial mortgage payment. The familiar loan officer greeted her with genuine sympathy before sliding a printed notice across the polished desk. Olivia read every line twice. Unless the remaining balance was paid within 30 days, foreclosure proceedings would begin. Her fingers tightened around the paper, but she calmly thanked the officer before walking outside. She refused to cry inside the bank. She crossed the street and sat alone on a weathered bench overlooking a quiet city park. Children laughed near a fountain while office workers hurried past carrying coffee cups and briefcases. Life continued moving around her as though nothing had changed. She slowly opened her sketchbook, the one her father had given her on her 16th birthday. The first page held a handwritten note in faded blue ink. Never stop creating beauty, live. The world always needs more of it. She smiled through moist eyes before turning to a blank page and absent-mindedly sketching the old maple tree standing in front of her childhood home. Drawing had always been her way of thinking. Every careful line seemed to quiet the noise inside her mind. Her phone vibrated. It was her mother. Olivia answered immediately, forcing warmth into her voice. Margaret happily described a neighbor who had brought homemade soup and asked whether Olivia would be home for dinner. Olivia glanced once more at the foreclosure notice resting beside her on the bench before answering with complete confidence that everything was going to be all right. She had no idea how, but she could not bear adding another burden to her mother's heart. After ending the call, she carefully folded the notice and slipped it deep inside her bag where her mother would never accidentally find it. The afternoon breeze carried away a few loose sketchbook pages before Olivia quickly gathered them. One page drifted toward a pair of polished black shoes stopping only a few feet away. A man's hand picked up the drawing before she could reach it. He looked at the sketch for several quiet seconds, studying every careful pencil stroke instead of simply handing it back. Olivia stood, slightly embarrassed. "I am sorry," she said with a gentle smile. "The wind has a mind of its own today." The stranger returned the page without introducing himself. His tailored charcoal suit suggested someone accustomed to boardrooms rather than public parks. Yet there was an unexpected softness in his expression as he glanced once more at the drawing. "You captured something photographs usually miss," he said quietly. "You made it feel like home." Before Olivia could respond, a black luxury sedan stopped at the curb behind him. The driver stepped out, speaking in a respectful but urgent tone. "Mr. Carter, the board meeting starts in 15 minutes. Olivia barely noticed the name. She simply thanked the stranger, tucked the sketch safely back into her notebook, and continued walking, unaware that the brief encounter had just interrupted the carefully planned future of one of the wealthiest men in America. Ethan Carter barely heard the elevator music as it carried him toward the executive boardroom on the 48th floor. His thoughts remained fixed on the young woman in the park whose sketch had somehow captured more emotion in a few pencil strokes than most professional marketing campaigns ever managed. It was an unnecessary distraction, he reminded himself. Right now, Carter Global Technologies needed solutions, not sentiment. The elevator doors opened onto polished walnut floors and walls lined with framed magazine covers celebrating the company's remarkable rise over the past decade. Those headlines suddenly felt like relics from another lifetime. Inside the boardroom, 12 directors waited around a long glass table overlooking the Chicago skyline. Every face reflected concern. Some looked exhausted. Others looked impatient. At the far end sat Harold Whitmore, the company's oldest board member and the man who had served alongside Ethan's late father for nearly 30 years. Harold quietly folded a financial report before speaking. The lenders have agreed to one final extension, but only if investor confidence improves immediately. Another director projected a series of charts onto the large screen. Revenue had slowed. Acquisition talks had stalled. Competitors were spreading rumors that Carter Global was preparing to sell off key divisions. Although none of the rumors were true, perception had become almost as dangerous as reality. Ethan remained, composed while reviewing every number. Our technology pipeline is still stronger than anyone else's, he said firmly. The next product launch changes everything. Several directors nodded, but no one looked convinced. Finally, Harold leaned forward. Your technology is not the issue anymore, Ethan. Confidence is. Silence settled across the room. Harold continued carefully, choosing every word with obvious reluctance. Institutional investors believe the company lacks long-term stability. They see a brilliant chief executive officer who spends every waking hour inside this building, has no personal life, no family, and no clear succession plan. They are investing in uncertainty. Ethan almost smiled at the absurdity. You are suggesting Wall Street is worried because I work too much? I am suggesting, Harold replied gently, that perception drives markets. Whether we like it or not, they believe stability begins with leadership. Another director slid a confidential folder across the table. Inside was the proposed framework prepared by outside consultants. The recommendation was surprisingly simple. Present the public with an image of permanence, a respected marriage, community involvement, a stronger personal story that reassured investors the company's future extended beyond quarterly earnings. Ethan closed the folder without another glance. I will not stage my private life for shareholders. No one argued. Yet no alternative appeared either. The meeting ended with uneasy silence hanging over every conversation. 2 hours later, Ethan stood alone inside his office overlooking Lake Michigan. The city shimmered beneath late afternoon sunlight, while unanswered emails continued filling his screen. A soft knock interrupted his thoughts. His executive assistant, Claire Donovan, entered carrying a thin cream-colored envelope. This was delivered by legal counsel, she explained. They said it cannot wait. Ethan opened the envelope and slowly read the summary inside. The investment consortium financing the emergency restructuring had quietly added a final condition. Public confidence had to be restored within 3 weeks before billions of dollars would be released. Without those funds, the company would likely lose critical contracts before the end of the quarter. Ethan placed the document on his desk beside a framed photograph of his parents on their wedding anniversary. His father had often said that trust took decades to earn and only minutes to lose. Looking at their smiling faces, Ethan wondered what advice they would give him now. Across the city, Olivia unlocked the front door of her childhood home carrying 2 bags of discounted groceries. The familiar scent of cinnamon greeted her as her mother smiled from the kitchen table, pretending she had not spent the afternoon sorting unpaid medical invoices into neat little piles. Olivia quickly tucked the foreclosure notice deeper inside her canvas bag before helping prepare dinner. They laughed over simple stories, shared homemade soup, and spoke about everything except money. Later that evening, after Margaret had gone to bed, Olivia sat alone on the front porch beneath the old maple tree she had sketched earlier that day. She looked at the brass house key resting in her palm, quietly promising the home itself that she would find some way to protect it. At that exact moment, only a few miles away, Ethan stared once more at the legal proposal lying on his desk. He still hated every word written inside it. But for the first time in his career, he faced a problem that intelligence alone could not solve. Neither of them realized that before another sunrise, fate would place an impossible offer between a billionaire desperate to save his company and a young woman determined to save the only home she had ever loved. Ironically, the answer Ethan had rejected only hours earlier refused to leave his mind. Long after most of the lights inside Carter Global Technologies had gone dark, he remained alone in his office, reading the legal proposal for what felt like the 100th time. Every paragraph sounded cold, calculated, and entirely unlike the life he had spent years building. A contractual marriage, public appearances, separate financial protections, a fixed one-year term. It reduced one of life's most personal commitments to a business strategy. Ethan closed the folder again, convinced he would never agree to it. Then his phone rang. Harold Whitmore spoke without his usual calm confidence. Another institutional investor had suspended negotiations until concerns about leadership stability were resolved. They still believed in the company's technology. They no longer believed in its future. Ethan thanked him quietly before ending the call. He stood beside the floor-to-ceiling windows overlooking the city. Thousands of apartment lights glowed beneath him, each one representing families sharing dinner, celebrating birthdays, helping children with homework, or simply living ordinary lives. Success had earned him everything except the one thing investors suddenly believed mattered most. The following morning began like every other for Olivia Bennett. She arrived at the community art center carrying paintbrushes, construction paper, and homemade muffins for the children in her class. Within minutes, the room filled with laughter as small hands eagerly reached for bright colors. Olivia moved from table to table, encouraging every child to paint whatever made them feel happy instead of worrying whether it looked perfect. One little girl proudly held up a drawing filled with uneven houses and oversized flowers. "Does it look real?" she asked nervously. Olivia smiled warmly. "The best pictures do not have to look real. They only have to tell the truth about how you feel." Those simple words lingered in the mind of a visitor quietly watching from the hallway. Claire Donovan had arrived at the center under Ethan's instructions to learn more about the woman from the park before any impossible decision was made. She had expected someone ambitious or eager to impress wealthy donors. Instead, she found a teacher who remembered every child's name, knelt beside nervous students without hesitation, and celebrated effort more than talent. Claire watched Olivia stay after class to help clean spilled paint before personally thanking every volunteer. Nothing about her appeared rehearsed. That afternoon, Claire returned to Carter Global carrying only a slim folder. "Background check?" Ethan asked. Claire nodded. "No scandals. No lawsuits. No hidden relationships. She works 2 jobs, volunteers every week, and has quietly been paying her mother's medical bills. She is weeks away from losing her childhood home, but according to everyone we interviewed, she has never asked anyone for help." Ethan remained silent while looking through the photographs inside the file. One showed Olivia laughing beside a group of children covered in colorful paint. Another captured her helping an elderly neighbor carry groceries up a porch. There were no glamorous events, no expensive vacations, no carefully managed public image. Only ordinary kindness repeated again and again. Claire hesitated before speaking once more. "There is something else. She never mentioned meeting you in the park. I do not think she recognized who you were." That surprised Ethan more than anything else. For years, almost everyone he encountered either wanted something from him or knew exactly how much his name was worth. Olivia had treated him like any other stranger whose shoes happened to catch a loose sketch drifting across the sidewalk. Late that afternoon, Ethan drove alone to the quiet neighborhood where Olivia lived. He did not stop in front of her house. Instead, he parked across the street beneath a large maple tree whose branches stretched over the modest homes lining the block. He watched as Olivia stepped outside carrying a watering can. She carefully tended a row of fading flowers planted along the front walk before helping her mother settle into a porch chair with a blanket despite the mild breeze. They talked, laughed softly, and shared iced tea as the evening sunlight settled across the neighborhood. Nothing about the scene resembled the luxury magazines that constantly pursued Ethan's attention, yet he found himself unable to look away. For the first time in weeks, the endless pressure surrounding billion-dollar negotiations faded into the background. He realized he was looking at something money could never manufacture. As he quietly started the engine to leave, Olivia noticed the unfamiliar sedan parked across the street. She offered a polite wave, assuming someone had simply taken a wrong turn. Ethan instinctively lifted his hand in return before driving away. Neither of them understood that by the end of the next day, they would be sitting across from each other with a contract on the table, each believing they were about to sacrifice their future to save something they loved even more. The next afternoon, Olivia received a phone call she almost ignored because she did not recognize the number. Between shelving books during her shift at the neighborhood bookstore, she quietly answered, expecting another collection agency. Instead, a calm, professional voice introduced herself as Claire Donovan from Carter Global Technologies and politely asked whether Olivia would be available for a confidential meeting that evening. Olivia frowned with genuine confusion. "I think there must be some mistake," she replied. "I do not work in technology." Claire smiled softly through the phone. "There is no mistake, Miss Bennett. Mr. Ethan Carter would like to speak with you personally. It will only take an hour, and transportation will be provided if you are comfortable accepting." Olivia almost declined. Her life had never crossed paths with billion-dollar companies, and she could not imagine why one of the country's most successful chief executive officers wanted to meet an art teacher. Yet something about Claire's respectful tone made the invitation feel sincere rather than intimidating. After promising to arrive on her own, Olivia finished her shift and changed into the nicest outfit she owned, a navy blue dress paired with the same beige coat she had worn in the park. Before leaving home, she kissed her mother on the forehead and simply said she had an unexpected meeting about possible volunteer funding for the community center. It was easier than explaining something she did not understand herself. Carter Global's headquarters looked even more impressive from the lobby than it had from magazine photographs. Towering glass walls reflected the evening skyline, while employees quietly moved through the building with practiced confidence. Olivia followed Claire through a series of elegant hallways until they reached a private conference room overlooking Lake Michigan. Fresh coffee rested on the table, beside a neatly organized folder. Moments later, the door opened, and Ethan entered alone. He wore a charcoal suit without a tie, looking less like the untouchable businessman she had imagined and more like the thoughtful stranger who had returned her sketch in the park. "Thank you for coming," he said sincerely. Olivia smiled politely. "I am still trying to understand why I am here." Ethan remained standing for a brief moment before answering with complete honesty. "Because I need your help." Those words surprised her far more than if he had offered a job. She glanced around the luxurious room, then back at the billionaire standing across from her. "I think you may have overestimated what I can do." Ethan slowly sat across the table. "Perhaps, but I would rather tell you the truth than invent a story." For nearly 20 minutes, he explained the growing pressure surrounding Carter Global. He described nervous investors, uncertain markets, and the belief that public confidence in his leadership had weakened. He did not exaggerate. He did not blame anyone else. He simply described the impossible position he faced. Olivia listened quietly without interrupting. When he finally finished, she looked genuinely sympathetic. "That sounds incredibly difficult," she admitted. "But I still do not understand where I fit into any of this." Ethan reached for the folder resting between them, but hesitated before opening it. It was the first time in years he had struggled to begin a business conversation. Finally, he placed the document in front of her. "The board believes a stable public marriage would restore confidence. I told them I would never ask anyone to become part of a business strategy." He paused before meeting her eyes again. "Then I met you." Olivia stared at him, unsure whether she had heard correctly. Ethan continued before she could speak. "I know this sounds unbelievable. I am asking you to consider a legal marriage lasting 1 year. It would be a real marriage under the law, but based on a written agreement. In return, your mortgage would be paid in full, your mother's remaining medical expenses would be covered, and you would receive financial independence, regardless of what happens afterward." The room became completely silent. Olivia slowly looked down at the unopened contract before gently pushing it back toward him. "Mr. Carter," she said with quiet dignity, "I cannot marry someone because they can solve my problems." Ethan nodded slowly. "That is exactly the answer I expected." He stood, prepared to end the meeting with respect rather than persuasion. Then Olivia noticed a familiar object partially visible inside the folder. It was the sketch she had lost in the park. Ethan had carefully preserved it between protective sheets of paper. Looking at the drawing, she realized he had not invited her because she fit a corporate image. He had remembered a simple moment that everyone else would have forgotten. Neither of them spoke for several long seconds, but for the first time the impossible proposal felt less like a transaction and more like two strangers standing at the edge of a decision that could change far more than either of them was prepared to imagine. Olivia carried the contract home without opening it. It remained inside her canvas bag beside the folded foreclosure notice and the old sketchbook that had quietly followed her through every important chapter of her life. The train ride back to her neighborhood felt unusually long. Outside the window, Chicago moved with its familiar evening rhythm as commuters hurried toward dinners, families, and ordinary conversations. Olivia wondered how many of them were making impossible decisions without anyone else knowing. When she reached home, she found her mother sitting on the porch beneath the maple tree with a knitted blanket across her lap. Margaret smiled the moment she saw her daughter. "Your meeting lasted longer than I expected," she said warmly. Olivia returned the smile and sat beside her. It was unexpected. They spent the next hour talking about simple things. A neighbor had finally repaired his old fence. The roses in the front yard needed more water. A little boy down the street had proudly ridden his bicycle without training wheels for the first time. Olivia treasured those ordinary conversations because they reminded her what she was, fighting to protect. Later that night, after her mother had fallen asleep, Olivia placed the contract on the kitchen table and slowly began reading every page. The language was formal but surprisingly respectful. Ethan had insisted on several unusual clauses. She would always have complete freedom to continue teaching. She would never be required to abandon her own career or friendships. Every financial arrangement would remain transparent and legally protected. At the end of 1 year, if either of them wished to end the marriage, she would leave with the promised financial security and no further obligations. There was even a handwritten note attached to the final page in Ethan's careful handwriting. "I do not expect you to trust me today. I only ask that you believe I will honor every promise written here." Olivia read the sentence several times before quietly closing the folder. The proposal still felt unbelievable, yet it no longer felt heartless. The following morning, she visited the bank once more, hoping for a miracle she already knew would not come. The same loan officer greeted her kindly, but offered the same answer. The deadline could not be extended again. Walking back toward her car, Olivia noticed an elderly man struggling to load several heavy bags of garden soil into the trunk of his sedan. Without hesitation, she crossed the parking lot and helped him finish. The grateful stranger thanked her repeatedly before driving away with a smile. Olivia stood there for a moment, realizing she had instinctively helped someone else while her own future remained uncertain. That afternoon, Ethan sat through another tense meeting with legal advisors, investment partners, and members of the board. Every conversation circled back to the same conclusion. Time was running out. After the meeting ended, Harold quietly remained behind. "Did you ask her?" he said gently. Ethan nodded. "She has not answered." Harold looked out across the skyline before speaking again. "If she says no, you accept it." "I know." "And if she says yes," Harold continued, "remember that she is agreeing to carry a burden she did not create. Do not ever let her feel like an employee performing a service." Ethan answered without hesitation. "I would never treat her that way." Harold studied him for a long moment before smiling faintly. "Good. Because I have watched you negotiate billion-dollar acquisitions without showing emotion. Yesterday, when you spoke about Miss Bennett, you sounded like a man afraid of disappointing someone for the first time." Ethan did not respond. The observation felt uncomfortably accurate. That evening, Olivia returned to the community art center for another class. Before leaving, one of her youngest students handed her a folded piece of construction paper decorated with uneven hearts and bright yellow stars. Inside, the child had written in large, careful letters, "Thank you for making everything brighter." Olivia tucked the handmade card inside her sketchbook, suddenly overwhelmed by how often the most valuable gifts came from people with the least to give. As she stepped outside, her phone vibrated. The caller identification displayed Ethan Carter. She stood quietly beneath the fading evening sky before answering. His voice remained calm and respectful. "Miss Bennett, I apologize for calling unexpectedly. I only wanted to tell you there is no pressure. If your answer is no, I will understand completely." Olivia looked toward the familiar street leading home, then down at the brass key resting in her hand. She thought about her mother's peaceful smile, the foreclosure notice waiting inside the kitchen drawer, the children depending on her every week, and the handwritten promise Ethan had added to the contract himself. After several silent seconds, she finally spoke. "Mr. Carter, before I give you my answer, there is something I need you to see." If you still want me to marry you after that, then we will talk again tomorrow. The next afternoon, Ethan left the downtown skyline behind and followed the navigation instructions Claire had quietly entered into his car. The roads gradually became narrower, lined with mature maple trees, modest brick homes, and neatly trimmed front lawns where children played basketball beneath fading summer sunlight. Nothing about the neighborhood resembled the world of luxury hotels or executive boardrooms. Yet he found himself slowing the car as though entering a place that deserved quiet respect. Olivia was already waiting on the front porch when he arrived. She wore a simple light blue sweater and jeans, holding the same canvas bag that had first caught his attention in the park. There were no photographers, no security teams, and no formal introductions. She greeted him with the same calm smile she offered everyone else. "Thank you for coming," she said softly. Ethan nodded. "You said there was something I needed to see." Instead of answering immediately, Olivia led him through the small front gate. The old maple tree stretched across the yard, casting gentle shadows over weathered wooden steps that had clearly been repaired many times over the years. The house itself was modest but lovingly maintained. Fresh flowers surrounded the porch despite their age, and colorful wind chimes quietly moved with the afternoon breeze. "My father planted those flowers every spring," Olivia said. "After he passed away, my mother and I promised we would never let them disappear." Ethan listened without interrupting. Inside the house, family photographs filled nearly every wall. There were pictures of birthday parties, school graduations, fishing trips, holiday dinners, and one faded photograph of a teenage Olivia proudly holding the very same sketchbook she still carried today. None of the frames matched, but together they created something far more valuable than expensive artwork. Margaret Bennett welcomed Ethan with surprising warmth after Olivia introduced him simply as a businessman seeking advice about a community project. Ethan felt unexpectedly guilty accepting the kind invitation, yet he understood why Olivia had chosen not to reveal the truth. They shared homemade lemonade around the kitchen table, while Margaret spoke proudly about her daughter. She described the evenings Olivia stayed awake, making lesson plans for children who could not afford private art classes, the weekends she spent helping neighbors repair fences or paint community buildings, and the countless times she quietly sacrificed her own needs without mentioning them to anyone. Olivia blushed, with gentle embarrassment each time her mother praised her, trying unsuccessfully to change the subject. After Margaret excused herself to rest, Olivia carried 2 mugs of coffee onto the back porch where the late afternoon sun painted golden light across the yard. She finally looked directly at Ethan. "This is what I needed you to see." Ethan glanced around, confused. "The house." She nodded. "Not because it is valuable. Financially, it is probably worth very little compared to your world. But every memory I have begins here. My father taught me to draw beneath that tree. My mother still believes she will watch future grandchildren play in this yard someday. If I sign your contract only because I am afraid of losing this place, I will resent both you and myself. I cannot begin any agreement built on resentment." Ethan quietly absorbed every word. After a long silence, he reached into the inside pocket of his jacket and removed the contract. Without opening it, he placed it on the small wooden table between them. "Then let us change it." Olivia looked at him with genuine surprise. Ethan continued calmly. "Cross out anything that feels unfair. Add any condition that protects your dignity, your family, your work, or your future. If there is a single sentence that makes you feel like you are being purchased instead of respected, we remove it." Olivia stared at him, searching his expression for even the smallest sign of manipulation. She found none. The billionaire sitting across from her no longer sounded like a man negotiating a corporate transaction. He sounded like someone asking permission to share an impossible burden. Slowly, she opened her sketchbook and removed the handmade card one of her students had given her the day before. She handed it to Ethan without saying a word. He read the child's uneven handwriting that thanked Olivia for making everything brighter, then carefully returned it. "People trust you because you make their lives better," he said quietly. Olivia smiled faintly. "That is exactly why I am afraid. If I agree to this, I cannot pretend to be someone I am not." Ethan met her eyes with complete sincerity. "Then do not pretend. If this marriage happens, the only person I am asking you to be is Olivia Bennett." For the first time since the impossible proposal had entered her life, the fear inside Olivia began giving way to cautious hope. and as the evening breeze gently stirred the maple leaves above them, she realized the decision before her was no longer about choosing between money and pride, but about deciding whether two strangers could build trust before they ever had the chance to build love. The following morning sunlight poured through the tall windows of Carter Global Technologies as Olivia stepped into the headquarters carrying her canvas bag instead of an expensive designer purse. Employees politely greeted her without recognizing that the woman walking across the marble lobby might soon become the public face of the company. Claire Donovan welcomed her with a warm smile and escorted her to a private conference room where a revised contract rested neatly on the polished table. Several pages had already been removed. Fresh copies waited beside a fountain pen. Ethan stood when Olivia entered, not out of corporate formality, but simple respect. "I made the changes we discussed," he said quietly. Olivia opened the document and slowly read each page. The financial arrangements remained, but every sentence that sounded like ownership had disappeared. New clauses protected her independence, guaranteed continued support for the Community Arts Center regardless of the marriage, and confirmed that no public appearance would ever be required without her full agreement. Near the final page, she noticed one additional sentence written in plain language instead of legal terminology. "We agree to treat each other with honesty, dignity, and kindness even when this agreement becomes difficult." Olivia looked up from the contract. Lawyers usually do not write like this. Ethan smiled for the first time since they had met. "They did not. I did." She closed the folder without speaking immediately. Through the glass walls, she could see employees beginning another busy workday, carrying laptops, greeting coworkers, and preparing for meetings that might determine the future of the company. None of them knew how much depended upon the conversation taking place behind those doors. Olivia finally reached into her canvas bag and placed 3 objects on the table: the foreclosure notice, the brass key to her childhood home, and the sketchbook her father had given her years before. Ethan recognized each item without asking. "These are the reasons I almost said yes," Olivia admitted softly. Then she gently moved the sketchbook closer to him while leaving the other 2 where they were. "But this is the reason I almost said no. If I lose myself, none of the other things matter." Ethan carefully picked up the sketchbook and turned to the first page where her father's handwritten message remained preserved in faded blue ink. He read the words silently before closing the cover again. "Your father wanted you to create beauty," he said. "I cannot promise this arrangement will be beautiful every day, but I promise I will never ask you to become someone he would not recognize." The room fell completely silent. Olivia studied his face, searching once again for hesitation or hidden motives. Instead, she found something unexpected: vulnerability. Behind the confidence that had built a billion-dollar company stood a man who understood that success could not solve every problem. She slowly reached for the fountain pen. "I have one final condition," she said. Ethan nodded immediately. "Name it." Olivia took a slow breath. "When this year ends, if either of us wants to walk away, we do it with gratitude instead of resentment. No public accusations. No revenge. No lawyers trying to destroy each other. We leave knowing we kept our promises." Ethan extended his hand across the table before she had even signed the document. "Agreed." She shook his hand. It was the first time they had willingly touched without obligation, and the simple gesture carried more sincerity than either expected. Moments later, Olivia signed her name. Ethan signed beneath hers. Claire quietly witnessed the agreement before collecting the documents with visible relief. No celebration followed. No dramatic speeches filled the room. Instead, Ethan picked up the brass house key and gently placed it back into Olivia's hand. "This belongs with you," he said. "It always will." Olivia wrapped her fingers around the key, feeling its familiar weight. For the first time in weeks, she believed the front door of her childhood home might remain unlocked to hope instead of foreclosure. As they prepared to leave the conference room, Claire reminded them that the public announcement would be made in 48 hours, and the wedding would take place 1 week later. The schedule sounded impossible, yet neither objected. Standing beside the elevator, Olivia glanced toward the bustling offices where hundreds of employees unknowingly depended on a decision she had just made. Ethan noticed the uncertainty in her expression. "You can still change your mind," he said quietly. Olivia looked at the sketchbook tucked safely beneath her arm, then at the brass key resting in her coat pocket before meeting his eyes with calm determination. No, she answered. Now that I know this is about protecting people instead of protecting appearances, I think it is time we both keep the promises we just signed, even if neither of us can imagine where those promises will eventually lead. 1 week later, the bells of St. Andrew's Cathedral echoed across downtown Chicago as guests rose from polished wooden pews and turned toward the grand entrance. Outside, reporters crowded behind velvet barriers while helicopters circled high above the city skyline, broadcasting every moment to millions of viewers across America. Financial commentators spoke excitedly about renewed confidence in Carter Global Technologies, while entertainment hosts admired the elegance of the ceremony. None of them understood the quiet promises that had been made long before the cameras arrived. Ethan stood at the altar wearing the same calm expression he had perfected through years of negotiating impossible business deals. Yet this morning felt entirely different. Every step that had brought him there carried a responsibility no balance sheet could measure. Across the cathedral, the doors slowly opened, and Olivia appeared beneath soft afternoon light, wearing a timeless white gown that reflected neither extravagance nor excess but simple grace. She carried a bouquet of white roses tied together with a satin ribbon, and hidden beneath that ribbon rested the familiar brass key to her childhood home. She had almost left it behind before realizing it represented everything she had chosen to protect. As she walked down the aisle, she noticed her mother smiling through quiet tears from the front row, healthier than she had looked in months because hope had finally replaced constant worry. Harold Whitmore watched with folded hands, silently grateful that the company his closest friend had built might survive after all. Claire Donovan stood nearby, remembering the frightened art teacher who had first entered the corporate headquarters carrying nothing more than a canvas bag and quiet dignity. The minister welcomed everyone before speaking about commitment, trust, and choosing to stand beside another person when the future remained uncertain. This time the words reached Ethan differently. They were no longer part of a public performance. They had become promises he genuinely intended to keep. When the moment arrived to exchange rings, Ethan looked directly into Olivia's eyes instead of toward the waiting cameras. "Thank you," he whispered softly enough that only she could hear. Olivia smiled with quiet surprise. "For what?" she whispered back. "For believing that people are worth saving." The minister invited them to continue with their vows. They spoke every sentence clearly, their voices steady despite knowing how unusual the path had been that led them to this moment. Around them, guests saw only a beautiful wedding. They could not see the foreclosure notice that no longer threatened a family's future, the handwritten promise that had transformed a legal agreement into a partnership built on respect, or the little sketchbook waiting safely inside Olivia's bag with her father's message still preserved on its first page. When they were finally pronounced husband and wife, gentle applause filled the cathedral instead of overwhelming celebration. Ethan and Olivia shared a simple smile that felt surprisingly natural. Outside, the newly married couple stepped onto the front steps where hundreds of cameras flashed at once. Questions filled the air about the future of the company, investment plans, and honeymoon destinations. Ethan answered only one. A reporter asked whether this marriage represented the beginning of a new business strategy. Ethan glanced toward Olivia before replying with complete sincerity. "Today is not about strategy. It is about keeping a promise." Beside him, Olivia quietly reached into her bouquet and felt the brass key resting beneath the ribbon. She realized she no longer carried it because she feared losing her home. She carried it because it reminded her that every meaningful decision begins by protecting the people who matter most. Across the city, markets responded with optimism, investors regained confidence, and employees at Carter Global celebrated what they believed was the beginning of a more stable future. Yet none of those victories meant as much to Ethan as the simple moment that followed after the last reporters finally stepped aside. Without photographers directing them or advisors whispering instructions, Olivia looked up at him and laughed softly when a light breeze scattered a few rose petals across the cathedral steps. Ethan laughed with her, the sound unfamiliar but genuine, and for the first time in many years he realized success did not begin inside a boardroom or appear on the front page of a financial newspaper. Sometimes it began with a sketch rescued from the wind, a humble house guarded by an old brass key, and two strangers courageous enough to choose trust before love, believing that if they honored every promise they had made today, Perhaps one day love would quietly grow strong enough to make every signature they had ever written seem wonderfully unnecessary.